March 6, 1983, Langley, Virginia, 3:42 p.m. The envelope arrived in a plain government pouch, buried among travel advisories and embassy transit logs, stamped unclassified but already drawing heat from the paper. Pale beige cardstock, rough at the edges, the stamp misaligned, clearly affixed by hand. It bore no return address. The postmark read Berlin, though someone had circled it in blue ink with a question mark. Warren Folsom, Desk 6, Mail Triage, Mid-Tier Clearance, felt the strange weight of the thing before he slid it open. Inside, 2 pages, one handwritten in tight Cyrillic, the other a hand-annotated satellite photograph, overlaid with parabolic arcs, ink circles, and numerical entries in red. The handwriting was dense, deliberate, neither rushed nor hesitant. The smell of machine oil clung faintly to the paper. The graphite had a mechanical shine, rubbed in places, smudged at the corners like the writer had hesitated while folding. There was no signature, only 2 initials at the bottom of the second page, VI. A second insert, smaller than the others, had been folded into quarters and tucked between the pages. On it, a single phrase in English. Channel Echo. Initiate. The photo showed the Turatum Cosmodrome under partial snow cover, captured at a downward oblique angle. The marked coordinates corresponded to a low-elevation launch pad, currently inactive. What stood out was a pencil outline tracing the silhouette of a shuttle-sized vehicle, unlike the standard Buran test models, narrower along the fuselage, larger in the engine bell section. Folsom didn't recognize the configuration. He flagged the envelope for immediate transfer to Department 118. By 4:20 p.m., the letter had passed through 3 handlers. Each left a code mark in graphite on the back of the photograph, time-stamped and initialed, a procedure used for chain of custody and classified intake. The pages were placed into a pressurized transport sleeve and moved to the 4th floor for review by the CIA's Soviet aerospace liaison. 3 hours later, a secure memo drafted by Liaison Chief Harrowell described the document's contents as insider-level data regarding an orbital prototype not previously recorded in U.S. technical briefings. The text included thermodynamic values for kerosene hypergolic propulsion, advanced ablative tile shielding tolerances, and telemetry blind zones over Kamchatka and Lake Balkhash. One line in the letter was underlined twice by Harrowell in red. Do not underestimate its glide range. I have run simulations they do not yet believe. Harrowell noted this was not the language of hearsay. It was written by someone with engineering discipline, someone involved in systems design rather than logistics. His marginalia, made in tight mechanical pencil, included only 3 phrases: internal access, non-diplomatic origin, and likely suicidal. That evening, a shortwave test signal was dispatched from the Southern Bavarian relay station via encrypted sequence Echo 6. A 3-second burst, masked within weather station telemetry, echoed across the Soviet western spectrum. Nothing returned. That was expected. The signal had been a handshake, not a conversation. Back in Langley, the document was placed in an interim file under the name Cosmos Draft VI. It was given Priority 4 triage status, meaning it would bypass standard classification delay but not yet trigger a joint task force. That changed at 6:10 p.m., when a defense intelligence analyst recognized a pressure test stamp visible in the lower right of the satellite photo. The stamp, barely visible, matched documentation from a Soviet telemetry review conference held inside Facility 23B, Kaliningrad District, in January 1982. Only 3 foreign nationals had ever been inside 23B. All were accounted for, which meant the source had been internal. That night, behind a sealed door in the east wing of the Langley complex, 6 photographs were arranged on a table under soft halogen lights. One showed a group of Soviet engineers posing in front of a prototype cryogenic booster. The photograph was grainy, taken through a long lens. In the back row, barely distinguishable, stood a man with a shaved head, narrow shoulders, and a quiet stance, marked in red ink. Possible VI. The photo was dated September 1981. The man had been identified previously as Viktor Ivanenko, senior propulsion engineer, Kaliningrad 23B, subject of one previous GRU field intercept in 1978 concerning cryogenic transfer loss anomalies. Not deemed valuable then. Now, in light of the envelope, his name re-emerged. The initial file marked Cosmos Draft V was reclassified to Echo Red, Preliminary Asset Inquiry. A provisional note was entered under Ivanenko's name. It read, Probable source, motivated, unknown instability. No orders were given that night, only preparations. Beyond the metal shelves in the secure archive room, the fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting a flat glow over the scanner glass, and the sheet-fed copier left idle. A file folder sat open beside a ceramic mug, now cold, ringed with a trace of instant coffee. Nothing about it looked historic. Everything about it was. Kaliningrad District, USSR. Every morning began the same way. The electric kettle wheezed against the wall, heating stale mineral water as the radio emitted soft static beneath state music. Outside, frost coiled along the balcony's iron rail like a rusted fingerprint. Viktor Ivanenko stirred a spoonful of condensed milk into his tea and wrote equations in a ledger already 3 years full, the ink smeared faintly, reacting with the cold paper. Behind him, the walls of his apartment held the smell of aging varnish, paraffin, and damp wool. He left by 7:30 a.m., always the same coat, always the same briefcase, dark leather, creased along the edge, carrying only pencils, a slide rule, and 5 worn pages of propulsion schematics. His commute passed unremarked. No words exchanged on the bus. No glances shared at the gate of Facility 23B. The guard nodded with the ease of repetition, scanning his pass against a clipboard that hadn't changed since 1976. Inside the gates, the world contracted. Hallways hummed with old filament lighting. Steel lockers lined the walls like cold shoulders. Engineers walked quickly, their faces held blank under directives to minimize conversation during transitions. Ivanenko's lab, Block 4C Propulsion Division, smelled of lithium grease and hot solder. The air held a constant pressure, like standing inside a thermos. Time moved in integers. His team worked on closed-cycle oxygen-kerosene engines for orbital transfer vehicles. The project, officially termed Program Verona, had survived 5 internal budget reviews by hiding under atmospheric sensor funding. Its real objective, a reusable glider that could enter low Earth orbit, photograph U.S. naval deployments, and return without radar exposure. The science was credible. The politics were not. Ivanenko never questioned the system aloud. That was suicide. He attended weekly briefings in silence, signed documents in triplicate, and nodded when the directorate's observers made their rounds. But in the evenings, his notebooks shifted tone. He stopped diagramming thrust curves and began charting procedural delays, days lost to bureaucratic reversals, weeks consumed by idle recalibration requests. He calculated the momentum loss of ideologically mandated inefficiency. The results were sickening. In 1981, he lost a junior engineer named Boria, dismissed for non-constructive attitudes after citing an American patent in a design proposal. The citation had been accurate. The punishment was immediate. Ivanenko never saw him again. His desk was cleared during lunch. That same year, Ivanenko received a personal letter, rare, blue-inked, from a cousin in Kiev. It smelled faintly of cologne and pipe smoke, full of neutral small talk about spring thaw and ration delays. But a postscript caught his eye. They've begun testing airburst sensors in the south. Different signatures than before. The paper trembled in his hands. He burned it over the kitchen sink that night, the edges curling like scorched leaves. By 1982, he no longer dreamed in Russian. His inner monologue began shifting, technical terms surfacing in English, equations forming in imperial units. He borrowed a French textbook from a colleague and spent weeks pretending to struggle with it, though he barely opened it. He kept an English-Russian aerospace glossary hidden inside the casing of a broken voltmeter in his desk drawer. His marriage, long exhausted by silence, remained intact through mutual fatigue. Tamara stopped asking why he didn't speak after work. She ironed his shirts with practiced indifference and spent her evenings reading state novels under a wool blanket that smelled of bleach and cabbage. She never asked about the envelope he kept inside the boiler casing. She never opened the drawer with the broken voltmeter. She never looked inside the briefcase once it returned home. In December 1982, Ivanenko was sent to Baikonur for a 3-day design review. He traveled with a ministry chaperone and spoke only when required. The hangar was vast, echoing with wind and the sharp tang of cold aluminum. One of the shuttles, coded Object 365K, sat stripped, ribs exposed like a whale carcass. The insulation tile system had failed during a reentry simulation, nearly destroying the prototype. The report blamed solar radiation variance. Ivanenko blamed political pressure to declare readiness before the anniversary of Gagarin's flight. In his hotel room that night, beneath a humming ventilation unit, he wrote his first draft of the letter. He used a pencil and no salutation. He addressed no agency, no person, just a statement of fact. They are building what they do not understand. He listed 5 structural faults, 2 of which could cause total loss of vehicle and crew. He described the testing data suppression. He ended with a request for contact, followed by an old chess notation from a game he had played against a Czech physicist in 1972, BXE6+. He did not send it then. Instead, he carried the paper folded inside his coat for 29 days. He rewrote it twice, burned one, hid the other in a disused schematic binder under a false tab labeled Coolant Mass Ratios. Each evening he checked it was still there. In February 1983, a former cosmonaut turned inspector visited Facility 23B. He made no mention of Verona. But Ivanenko saw him pause at a wall schematic, eyes narrowing, tracing the engine routing diagram with the tip of his pen. That night, Ivanenko moved the letter from the binder to his briefcase. 3 days later, during a routine calibration review, he noticed someone had touched the voltmeter drawer. The voltmeter was upside down. That evening, he walked 6 blocks in freezing wind, carrying a bag with outdated schematics and the letter wrapped inside. At the corner kiosk, he bought a German cigarette carton and tucked the paper inside before sealing it. He mailed it the next morning. No return address, no name. Just an orbit, a warning, and 2 letters. VI. March 20th, 1983. Berlin and Kaliningrad. At 0342 UTC, a coded burst struck the ionosphere over Central Europe. 3 seconds of compressed phase noise routed through civilian weather bands and wrapped inside standard telemetry garbage. It was elegant, imprecise, old Cold War radio technique dressed in digital clothes. From inside a listening post near Potsdam, the signal registered on channel 19A of a Soviet intercept bank, flagged by an obsolete filter algorithm, then missed by the exhausted officer tasked with scanning for NATO chatter. But someone else noticed. Inside Department 9 of the 2nd Chief Directorate, a cryptanalysis technician running backlogs picked up the anomaly 4 hours later. He cross-referenced its pulse structure with decommissioned NATO SATCOM formats and found an overlap. Echo 6. The designation had once referred to orbital counter-surveillance sweeps used by West German BND in 1974. It shouldn't have returned. A request for secondary review was filed and left in the inbox of a Major P. Rishkov, who wouldn't read it for another 16 hours. By then, the contents of Ivanenko's envelope had begun cascading through secure American channels. At Ramstein, 2 officers reviewed the diagrams under UV light and forwarded authentication signatures to Langley. A fragment of photographic overlay showed a polar alignment grid, not common for orbital test vehicles. Annotations referenced SE4 tracking gaps and rotational stability divergence. Analysts determined that the source had active, recent access to internal Soviet telemetry reviews. The operation moved from passive monitoring to active probe. A request was made to recontact VI. The CIA prepared a second burst, this one masked as station interference from a Yugoslav naval monitor. Timing was precise, modulation sharpened to cut through local atmospheric distortion over the Baltic coast. The message read, "Received. Confirm identity. Channel echo sustained. Secondary mark." In Kaliningrad, surveillance protocols lagged 2 steps behind the event. On March 21st, Directorate Archives flagged a name, Viktor Ivanenko, due to a 1981 inspection report listing him as present during an unsanctioned schematic review at Baikonur. That review had included references to telemetry suppression and launch irregularities, all later sanitized in the final report. Ivanenko's name had been annotated once. Stability concerns noted. No escalation recommended. But now his profile showed a match with a different kind of risk. He had worked on multiple orbital systems. He had access to reentry tolerances, nozzle heat margins, and material stress simulations, all marked at Level D clearance. His apartment was no longer anonymous. A low-priority file was pulled from the Kaliningrad archives, listing his personal movements. 5 years of identical patterns, tram schedules, lunch breaks, grocery purchases. Quiet. Too quiet. The first surveillance detail was untrained. 2 conscripts from administrative reserves. They loitered near his apartment block wearing military boots beneath civilian trousers. Ivanenko passed them without pause, eyes forward, wind cutting across his collar. He had already switched his tram route that morning, boarding 1 stop farther than usual. A man with nothing to fear never checks the horizon twice. He checked 3 times. Inside Facility 23B, changes unfolded slowly. A supervisor began asking redundant questions during briefings. A requisition form Ivanenko submitted for ceramic insulation tiles was returned marked "In Review," despite routine clearance. A desk drawer he never opened had been cleaned. His pencil sharpener was missing. That night, he shaved with his left hand for the first time in 5 years. 3 days later, his name was submitted for routine psychological reassessment, an internal test used to verify ideological compliance. Standard protocol dictated that results be reviewed only in cases of significant deviation, but this test would not be stored. It would be hand-delivered. What Ivanenko didn't know, a second file now ran parallel to his. It was marked confidential. Operative assessment in progress. The cover page bore the stamp of the Second Chief Directorate. Below it, 2 initials had been added by hand. AV, a rare marker indicating oversight by Deputy Director Alexei Venediktov, responsible for internal asset loyalty reviews. On March 28th, a typewritten memo was circulated among 5 desks in the Lubyanka building. It contained a list of 6 scientists with access to Verona telemetry data. Ivanenko's name was 3rd. The final sentence of the memo read, "Of these, only Subject 3 displays cognitive divergence from standard pattern." The hunt had begun, but the target had already moved. April 11th, 1983. Leipzig Trade Fair. The crowd moved with mechanical rhythm, muffled beneath the overhead loudspeakers calling out pavilion schedules in clipped, formal German. Fabrics rustled, briefcases bumped against wooden booths. Bright lights flickered overhead, casting flickering shadows against glass display cases of turbines and microprocessor shells. The air smelled of floor polish, sweat, and cigarette ash pressed into industrial carpet. At booth 1126, labeled Fernglasoptik und Vermessungssystem, a gray-suited man with cracked hands offered a thermos to a colleague from Dresden. It was labeled promotional material, branded with an East German export seal, neutral, disposable. 20 minutes later, the thermos arrived in the hands of a courier dressed as a West German academic. Wire-rimmed glasses, tweed coat, brittle smile. The exchange passed unremarked. They spoke of nothing but power ratings and calibration delays. By 3:15 p.m., the thermos had been passed again, this time into a diplomatic pouch destined for a courier van idling behind the Yugoslav consulate. Inside the thermos, beneath a false bottom of cheap aluminum, lay a folded wax envelope sealed with electrician's tape. Inside, a strip of microfilm, 3 centimeters wide, marked with a series of compressed images. Each showed segments of paper, photographed under low light, blurry edges, distorted margins, but legible. The content was unmistakable. 9 images in total, 5 from an internal Verona design review dated January 1983, showing error tolerances for reentry shielding and material fatigue logs. One showed a launch delay notice with handwritten annotations referencing Directive 3124Z, a ministry-level approval for orbital silence protocols. 2 were diagrams, overhead projections of an orbital glider's launch profile, and one image, slightly torn, showed coordinates hand-circled in red, overlaid onto a satellite topography map of Kazakhstan's eastern corridor. The file reached CIA hands in Frankfurt by midnight. An analyst named Lowell Hauser loaded the strip into a projector. The glow of the bulb cast grainy lines across the dark office. Fluorescent lights flickered above, timed to the ventilation cycle. Every 15 seconds, the sound of paper rustled across a neighbor's desk. Hauser adjusted the focus, froze the frame on the last image, the torn map, then picked up a pencil and traced the marked longitude and latitude. What emerged was not one launch site, but 2. The secondary site was not listed in any declassified orbital logs. No photographic evidence existed of active construction, but the coordinates matched a plateau near Balkash, known in previous military overlays only as Zone 14K. Previous surveillance had captured only vague movement: fuel trucks, gravel roads, metallic scaffolding buried under snow. A memo from Hauser reached Langley by noon the next day. It was brief. It read, "Subject has proven secondary access. Implies structural placement. Recommend immediate asset validation. Operation Echo Red now justified." Back in Kaliningrad, Ivanenko sat alone at his kitchen table, marking a small plastic chessboard with notations in blue pen. He played both sides slowly, each move deliberate. No radio, no lights but the amber coil of the kitchen lamp overhead, buzzing faintly, dimmed by old dust. The window leaked cold. He'd received nothing. No reply, no confirmation. But the thermos had been passed. The coordinates were real. The glider, Object 365K, had suffered damage during cold stage reentry, and repairs were not proceeding. Worse, a memo 2 days earlier had ordered the prototype's launch window moved forward by 90 days. The engine had not passed its thermal expansion test. The reentry data was still incomplete. Launch would be catastrophic. He folded a slip of paper with a new sequence of coordinates and placed it beneath the removable sole of his boot. On it he wrote only, "They will accelerate. The data is incomplete. Lives will be lost for parity. Stop them." 2 days later, an administrative audit team from the Ministry of Industry visited Facility 23B, It was framed as routine. Paperwork checks, file audits, 3 men in dark suits. They asked questions slowly, repeated answers, and never smiled. One stood too close. Another took notes in a pad marked with a blank front. Ivanenko's name was not called, but a file clerk named Romanov was escorted from the break room after speaking too casually about production delays. He did not return that week. At night, Ivanenko removed the boot sole and unwrapped the paper again. The ink had smudged from moisture. The last 3 digits of the second coordinate were unreadable. He rewrote them from memory, but doubt remained. On April 17th, a low-frequency radio burst returned from Channel Echo, 17 seconds, encoded. The signal was an acknowledgement. The operation was now active. He had become real, which meant the system would now try to erase him. May 2nd, 1983, Kaliningrad, USSR. He didn't sleep. He lay still with his eyes open, tracing ceiling cracks shaped like rivers he'd never see. The apartment was silent except for the ticking of a kitchen clock 2 rooms away, marking each second with dry, mechanical indifference. At 04:15, he stood and dressed without lights. His breath clouded faintly in the hallway. Spring hadn't arrived. The radiator was still dead. On his way to the tram stop, a black Volga idled across the intersection, engine running, no headlights, no license plates. A shape sat motionless behind the windshield. Ivanenko walked past, never turning his head, but adjusted his pace by 3 seconds to avoid the shadow's line of sight. At Facility 23B, the tone had changed. Conversations collapsed when doors opened. Paper trays emptied faster than they refilled. The photocopier in Sector 2 now required log entries for every duplicate. When Ivanenko submitted a request to recalibrate the injector testing rig, the response returned stamped with red ink, pending authorization by Directorate D. He knew what came next. Isolation. Compartmentalization. The reshuffling of project designations so that no single engineer retained the entire blueprint. Within weeks, he'd be boxed into a fraction of his own knowledge. By summer, he'd be erased. He responded with speed. After curfew, he broke the wax seal on the steel panel behind his kitchen sink. Inside, a sealed envelope, 1 reel of undeveloped microfilm, and a folded page of calculations he'd written a year earlier. They contained no secrets, only context. A map of wrong assumptions hidden in wrong numbers. Evidence not of theft, but of truth. He burned the microfilm, but he didn't burn the letter. He added a line in pencil across the bottom edge. Do not wait for a third. There is no third. 3 hours later, he left it at a railway storage locker near the freight terminal, paid in coins, no receipt. The key was mailed the same morning inside a stamped envelope addressed to a bakery in Vienna. He selected it from a public directory. There was no logic to it, only entropy. At the lab, 2 men from the directorate stood by the reactor housing when he arrived. They held clipboards and said nothing. One of them watched him work for 6 hours without speaking. During lunch, his access badge failed at the security gate. He was escorted back inside by a uniformed officer who used a master override key. They told him it was a system malfunction. No one believes malfunctions on Mondays. That night, Tamara asked if they were being watched. Her voice was low, but her hands were steady. He lied and said no. She asked if he'd done something. He said not yet. She didn't speak again that evening. When he rose to shave, he found his razor missing. In its place, a sealed packet of iodine gauze from a first aid kit. Nothing was said, but the message was clear. On May 4th, a request was made by Central Oversight to review Ivanenko's academic credentials. The inquiry was nominally clerical. It was routed through 3 departments and tagged with a classification code used for ideological reassessment. No error had been cited. The following day, he was ordered to attend a personnel reevaluation meeting. It was scheduled for May 12th. 10 days. He would not be there. That night, he unpacked a suitcase he hadn't touched in years. It smelled of metal and rotted cloth. Inside, a coat from his student days, worn boots, a flask still holding the dried residue of Polish vodka. He repacked it with documents, clean clothes, and a small canister of foreign shaving cream he'd traded for years ago and never opened. The escape protocol was simple but irreversible. Once activated, there could be no pause, no attempt to reverse course. He would vanish into process, smuggled through a transit line constructed in the shadows of the Cold War, operated not by ideologues but by bureaucrats who despised the chaos they served. He left a final note inside the heating vent, wrapped in plastic, sealed with string. It contained no names, only formulas, only dates, only the sentence, "I am not the first. You ignored the first." On the evening of May 9th, the tram ran late by 11 minutes. He counted every second without blinking. The next 3 days would decide whether he lived with a name or disappeared without one. May 19th, 1983, 04:02 a.m., Brest Rail Terminal. Mist hung low over the tracks, thick with the stench of diesel and cold iron. The platform lights buzzed against the fog, casting sodium halos that flickered across rain-slicked stone. Viktor Ivanenko stood beside track 4, unshaven, motionless, his breath a slow vapor. The train to Warsaw groaned behind him, couplings clanging like muffled chains in the dawn. His ticket bore the name Károly Szalai, Hungarian engineer, attending a metallurgy conference in Krakow. The papers had arrived 2 days earlier, hidden inside a hollowed-out guidebook left in a designated drop along the Kaliningrad freight yard fence. The packet had included forged credentials, 2 emergency ampules, 1 insulin, 1 cyanide, and a second-class rail pass punched with today's date. Boarding was scheduled for 4:10. The boarder was scheduled for 6:25. The corridor of the sleeper car smelled of antiseptic and sweat. Upholstery was worn thin at the edges, scuffed with grime. Ivanenko sat in berth 7C, window facing the outer yard, suitcase placed beneath the bench, coat folded across his lap. His eyes never left the reflection in the glass, scanning for shadows that didn't move, men who stared too long. At 04:06, the door to the lavatory clicked open 2 cars forward. A man entered wearing a beige trench coat, hands empty. 3 minutes later, the door opened again. A different man emerged, wearing the same coat, now carrying a folded newspaper and an attaché case. Between the 2 events, a brush pass had occurred inside a 1.5 square meter space. Neither man had spoken. Inside the newspaper, a passport with Polish entry stamps, currency and denominations not yet in circulation, and a matchbook with a grease pencil marking on the inside flap. Bulgakov 7. It was not a name. It was a street in Warsaw, 1 block from the Hungarian embassy's rear gate. The train shuddered and pulled forward. Ivanenko felt the movement in his knees, the vibration of possibility and risk. His palms itched. At the first checkpoint, the border guard took 17 seconds to inspect his documents. He tapped the passport cover once with his pen, then handed it back without comment. 90 kilometers from Brest. The lights cut off briefly. A power transfer between regional lines. A procedural anomaly lasting 6 seconds. In those 6 seconds, the second controller on duty in carriage 6 failed to return from the stairwell. He had stepped off during the delay, replaced by an embedded asset in a janitor's uniform now sweeping the aisle with theatrical slowness. At 05:57, a steward announced tea service in multiple languages: Russian, Polish, German, Hungarian. no one moved. As the train approached the inspection loop near Tiraspol, the passengers were ordered to disembark for a scheduled customs review. Ivanenko complied without hesitation. The platform was wet with melted frost, dark shoe prints trailing in every direction. Border officers moved with ritualized indifference, scanning, checking, signaling nothing. A uniformed agent gestured for Ivanenko to step aside. The tone was calm, but final. They asked for his bag. He passed it forward. They opened it. Inside were documents, clothing, shaving cream, and a cassette labeled Hungarian Seminar, 1976 Sopron. The customs officer sniffed, tapped the cassette, nodded once. Then something shifted. A voice behind Ivanenko called out in Belarusian. The tone wasn't official. It was familiar. Too familiar. He turned slightly. One of the guards had said his real name. The officer in front paused. His fingers hovered near the flap of the passport. One moment too long, one syllable too sharp. Ivanenko smiled thinly, as if misunderstanding. He corrected them, Salai, Koroi, and lifted the cassette. For the conference, he said quietly, without emphasis. It worked. The officer returned the bag, muttered a vague approval, and gestured him forward. But behind them, 2 more officers were walking briskly toward the checkpoint. One carried a radio, the other adjusted his holster. Ivanenko did not wait. He stepped through the customs gate and into the corridor marked for international transit. Behind him, the shouting began. But by then, he was already moving toward the embassy. 12 minutes later, his name no longer existed on either side of the platform. The next day, when Viktor Ivanenko's tram stop was missed that morning, it caused no alarms. His apartment door remained locked. The mailbox untouched. No noise inside, no footprints in the hallway dust. Tamara waited until dusk before dialing the number of his office supervisor. It rang twice, then cut. She tried again at midnight. No answer. By noon the next day, a ministry vehicle arrived at the apartment. 2 men entered with a locksmith and no explanation. They spoke to no one in the building. Inside, they opened every drawer, photographed every page, dusted each surface for residue and prints. The process was clean, efficient, antiseptic. The air reeked of rubber gloves and ammonia. By 1600, Tamara was taken from the flat without her coat. She carried only her handbag. She asked no questions and received no answers. At the holding facility, she was told her husband had committed administrative violations under Article 64B, Section 12. Her reassignment would be processed through Novosibirsk District 8. She never returned to Kaliningrad. Facility 23B was placed on internal rotation. This was a euphemism for suspicion. Every engineer was reassigned to temporary posts pending ideological clearance. Lanyards were revoked, desks emptied, lockers drilled open. Those with families in the Baltics were denied travel. Those with relatives abroad were placed under review. One technician, Eduard Sobolev, resigned without reason. He was arrested within 72 hours on charges of unauthorized data duplication. No trial followed. On May 25th, a new memorandum from the 2nd Chief Directorate was circulated to Directorate D. It listed 27 technical personnel potentially influenced by foreign leverage. The list included 4 former Verona engineers, 2 of whom had signed confidentiality waivers in 1978. Ivanenko's name was not listed. He had been erased from the list entirely. In Moscow, internal analysis teams assembled a timeline. They reconstructed Ivanenko's career from 1974 onward. They highlighted anomalies. Early work on discontinued cryogenic projects, access to data beyond his clearance grade, and 2 unreported visits to Baikonur. They flagged an irregularity in 1981, his handwritten correction of a stress margin formula not assigned to his division. The correction had been implemented without credit. The file showed it had saved a prototype from failure. This, too, became suspicious. 2 days later, a directive arrived from the Ministry of Defense. All documentation related to Program Verona would be consolidated into Section 11A, sealed under Vault Code Belka 9. Any engineer with more than 15% design authorship would be barred from international travel indefinitely. On June 1st, a note was placed on Tamara Ivanenko's file. Status: dependent of absent subject, relocation required. Meanwhile, within the CIA's Vienna post, the first full debriefing of VI began under blackout conditions. The sessions occurred in 4-hour shifts inside a concrete room cooled to preserve recording equipment. Ivanenko provided no political statements, no emotional reflections, only technical analysis. He mapped 3 entire launch configurations from memory. He identified failure modes in Object 365K that had not yet occurred. He warned of a test schedule acceleration window that, if followed, would result in loss of vehicle. His prediction proved exact. On June 3rd, the Soviets announced a maintenance deferral on a scheduled Verona test flight. No footage was aired, no photos released. The announcement was made by fax and lasted 1 sentence. Back in Kaliningrad, workers removed the project insignia from the 23B corridor walls. The adhesive residue remained, catching dust like bruises left in plaster. None of the engineers spoke aloud about Ivanenko. But every day, fewer returned. Some were reassigned, some vanished. Officially, he had never existed. Unofficially, he had forced a 1 billion ruble correction to a weapon that was never called one. There was no announcement, no trial, no execution, just silence, filed and stamped. The first operational summary on VI arrived at Langley in mid-June. It was marked Strict Confidence. Channel Echo exfil complete. The report totaled 211 pages. Inside, full debrief transcripts, comparative telemetry charts, and a memorandum recommending sustained contact. The file was distributed to only 7 recipients, all within the Directorate of Science and Technology. The technical data destabilized assumptions across 4 intelligence branches. Ivanenko had provided not only propulsion metrics and shielding tolerances, but confirmation of a hidden redundancy in Soviet launch infrastructure, a secondary orbital deployment schedule routed through Balkhash under civil weather surveillance cover. This knowledge shifted satellite watch timing, altered budget planning, and triggered a classified interagency directive titled Gray Horizon. But Ivanenko remained anonymous. His real name never appeared in the report. He was listed as Subject Echo 7 in all official logs. Only 2 handlers knew his face. He had no access to American currency, no contact with press, no freedom of movement beyond an 11-block zone in a European city whose name he was instructed not to write. He lived in a pension house under permanent false registration behind a double-locked door with no view. For 6 months, he requested nothing. Not newspapers, not books, not conversation. He walked twice a day, once before sunrise, once after midnight, both times with gloves, both times without urgency. A man studying how walls breathe. In Kaliningrad, the residue of his absence spread outward. The apartment was reallocated to a naval clerk with no engineering ties. The neighbors received a quiet notice regarding resettlement due to security transfer. Tamara Ivanenko was relocated to a textile compound near Ufa. She was issued a new work ID, a new surname, and an unofficial ban on correspondence. She never spoke of her husband again. Back at Facility 23B, no one mentioned Verona. The term was removed from archives, replaced with Aerodynamic Glide Development, Batch 11. Internal chatter moved on to newer acronyms, newer directives, but files still disappeared in the night, and once every few weeks, a technician was reassigned without reason. In December 1983, a test of Object 366A failed over the Sari-Shagan range. The glider broke apart at reentry interface. All telemetry ceased 11.3 seconds before impact. The crash site was sealed for 8 weeks. No footage survived. No foreign intercepts were confirmed. The Soviets issued a statement declaring a successful materials exposure test. No one believed it. In Zurich, Ivanenko received a single envelope. No return address. Inside, a translated article clipped from Scientific American. It discussed orbital reentry insulation and new Western tolerances for ablative shielding. His equations were quoted. No attribution. He read it twice, then burned it in the bathroom sink. The paper curled without color. No flame, just smoke and memory. 1 year later, CIA records showed his intake had decreased by 38%. He had ceased providing new intelligence. Analysts attributed the drop to exhaustion. His file was downgraded from Tier 1 to long-term hold. A final memo stamped in December 1984 read, Echo 7 unlikely to produce further actionable data. Monitor until expiration. No directive followed. No extraction plan. No reintegration effort. He continued to live under an invented name, in an apartment paid for by a fund that no longer remembered why it existed. Every month he received one envelope, always unmarked, always empty. A ritual, not a message. A gesture that told him, "You are not forgotten, only postponed." In Kaliningrad, the winter of 1984 froze the last echoes of the project. The building at 23B was repainted. Its former schematic wall was replaced with steel siding. No trace of glue remained, but the stain of subtraction lingered in the silence of each corridor, in the hollow laughter of the engineers who stayed quiet too long. The pension manager found him face down in the stairwell, coat still buttoned, gloves folded in one hand. No ID on his body, no pulse, no trauma. A quiet end. The death was filed under unspecified cardiac event. The name on the lease, Karoy Salai, matched no active embassy registry. Within 48 hours, the room was cleared by 2 men in neutral jackets who said little and packed fast. They removed nothing but a sealed folder and a book with no spine. There was no funeral. Across the continent, a file was unsealed for review inside the Langley archives. Project Echo. Subsection Red. Case 7. One request was filed to evaluate declassification potential. It was denied on the grounds of dormant asset containment. No one used the name Ivanenko. In Ufa, Tamara received a registered envelope with no sender. Inside was a certificate stating her husband had ceased duties as of May 19, 1983. No cause given. No return requested. She read it 3 times, then fed it into the communal stove beneath her apartment block. She never remarried. By 1987, the Verona program was frozen indefinitely. Official reports cited budget constraints. Internal memoranda pointed to strategic redundancy after the failure of Object 366A. The glider's wreckage was never recovered in full. Engineers assigned to its design were rotated into surveillance satellite divisions, stripped of access to reentry physics and propulsion vectors. The term Verona was no longer spoken, even in code. Back in Langley, new satellites filled the gaps left behind. Launch windows narrowed. Image resolution climbed. But inside the Directorate of Science and Technology, a footnote survived. Soviet telemetry reform post-Echo. No further elaboration. Only initials, VI. In 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a team of American archivists entered a former KGB outpost in Vilnius. Inside a steel drawer marked Second Chief Directorate, Internal Disputes, they found a thin, brittle file stamped with chemical damage. The cover bore one name, redacted, and 3 phrases, Directive 3124Z, Object 365K, and BXE6+. The drawer also contained 8 shredded memos and a burned ledger that still smelled faintly of kerosene. Over the next 5 years, independent researchers attempted to trace the real identity behind Subject Echo 7. No match surfaced. The initials VI could not be paired to any known defector. Engineers from Facility 23B had either died, vanished, or refused comment. One, when approached in 1993, broke a 20-minute silence only to say, he asked questions no one else dared write down. In 1996, a minor update appeared in the CIA's legacy assessment system. A flagged name, Karoy Salai, was linked to a long-expired Hungarian passport found during routine digital conversion. It bore an embedded identifier traceable to a defunct Vienna-based operation. The photo had faded. The record was incomplete. The entry was marked for archival only. That same year, a package arrived at the CIA's records center in McLean. No return address. Postmarked from Basel. Inside was a chessboard, half completed, missing a bishop. A note was taped to the underside. 6 words. No third. They launched it anyway. The package with the chessboard was shelved in a non-indexed corner of Langley's archives. No analysis followed. No retrieval was requested. The handwriting on the note was cross-referenced against defectors, clerks, operatives, analysts. Result: inconclusive. The phrase, "they launched it anyway," was flagged but not escalated. Internal notes suggested symbolic closure, not active threat. Years passed. By 2002, Project Echo was formally downgraded from classified to archived. Budget reports for the Verona Surveillance Initiative were rerouted through standard aerospace channels. What remained of the glider program's internal structure was quietly absorbed into atmospheric entry simulation labs. No legacy personnel were retained. No mention of Ivanenko was made. No initials entered the official chain of remembrance. In Kaliningrad, Facility 23B was repurposed into a civilian research park. The walls were repainted in cheerful colors. A new nameplate read, Center for Applied Kinetics and Propulsion Science. Behind the east wing, under rusted metal plating, one corridor remained welded shut. Inside, ash-colored walls, fractured ceramic tiles, and a single steel cabinet bearing a scorched tag, BXC6+. No key remained. The Americans digitized what they could. Soviet military archive releases after 1991 remained partial, heavily redacted, and scattered across ministries with no indexing logic. Verona's existence appeared nowhere in public literature. The glider's specs, the launch failures, the thermal anomalies all vanished. Even Ivanenko's technical notes, once preserved on microfilm, had degraded from chemical exposure during storage. Still, traces lingered. In 2011, an independent researcher at the University of Toronto discovered an offhand reference to Object 365K in a now-defunct German aerospace journal. The reference described unidentified high-altitude flight behavior, consistent with reentry shaping anomalies, recorded in 1982. The author was anonymous. The article had been printed once, never cited, never followed. In Moscow, former KGB internal records remained sealed by presidential order. Article 64 files remained exempt from review. Directorate D's records, particularly those tied to internal divergence, had been boxed and relocated multiple times, most recently to a holding facility outside Nizhny Novgorod. When asked, Russian authorities denied the existence of any scientist named Ivanenko tied to the Verona project. They offered no clarification. They needed none. By 2020, only a handful of CIA analysts remembered Echo at all. The case never entered the agency's official Cold War narrative. There were no documentaries, no footnotes in academic histories, no plaques, only a notation in an internal loss register. Subject provided actionable strategic warning, identity unconfirmed, presumed deceased. And yet, in the spring of 2023, a former U.S. aerospace engineer retired to Lisbon received a plain envelope. Inside, a photograph, black and white, low resolution, a chessboard, hand-carved, a pawn and a knight left standing. On the reverse, "You were right, I never corrected the margin." No signature. 3 months later, a declassified Soviet training tape appeared in a Moscow auction. It showed footage of heat-resistant paneling tests from the early 1980s. In one frame, a young man stepped briefly into view. He adjusted the camera, turned, and walked off frame. The clip lasted 3 seconds. His face was partially obscured, but his gloves matched the ones from the Zurich report. His initials were never known. His file remains closed. But his shadow still affects the angle of orbit, the tension in systems, the pause before ignition. His absence shapes everything that followed.